I received a call one evening from my director of security indicating that Gaggle had flagged a document that a student had written. In that document, the student was actually writing a suicide note to his family.
Sharing some pretty exact details of a plan, some goodbyes.
Telling them not to blame themselves for his actions, using words that Gaggle actually noticed as threatening and as concerning.
And it was clear that this was a unique situation and a very serious one.
Within a half an hour, we had police at the student's house. We were in conversation with the student's parents. The student was taken to crisis intervention and hospitalized for the issues that he was dealing with. I'm just thankful that we were made aware, we could intervene, and we could help this child.
The Gaggle program has just been very helpful to us as we look at safety security needs here. But even if it can just help us save one life, then it is well worth the time, energy, and money that it takes to help us keep our students safe.
The school cannot be the sole provider and the sole protector of our students. We truly have to work as a community. I sent an email out to our administrative team the next day saying, "We saved a life last night." It's not an email that I've ever sent before in my 16 years as a superintendent, and I hope I never have to send it again. However, I'm reassured knowing that we have this system in place that can help us to help students.
Okay, hello, and welcome to the premiere of eSchool News Virtual Leadership Event Series. I'm Kevin Hogan, and I will be your host for the next hour. I appreciate the time you're taking to join us, and I hope you find the information insightful. We're hoping to make our conversation with the panelists as interactive as possible, so I encourage you to type any questions or comments in the chat room. I would also like to thank the folks at Gaggle for supporting this event and for their continuous efforts within the industry to improve the way schools care for our children. Unfortunately, we obviously can't get together in person right now, but I am glad to have this platform to join you here in the ether. We worked on making the agenda and the format today a little bit easier on the eyes and ears as those other 35 Zoom calls you probably have had already today. This is also, as you can tell from the opening video, not the most pleasant of topics, but it is the most important. Even before the pandemic struck, school district leaders overwhelmingly understand that the physical and mental health is the #1 priority for their district. COVID-19 has just made that issue even more important. For many of the educators I've spoken with over the past spring and summer, it was actually the only priority. Before we get into our conversation with Mike and Eileen, I would like to share my interview with Karen Van Osdell, Senior Director of Practice at CASEL, which is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, to establish some big picture insights. Karen oversees multiple initiatives to support and scale SEL in school districts and with other collaborators in the field. Previously, she served as executive director for the Office of Social and Emotional Learning in the Chicago Public Schools, where she worked to ensure that all schools develop multi-tiered systems of support for students' social, emotional, and behavioral needs. Have a listen. Great. Thanks, Karen, for joining us. First, why don't you tell us a little bit more about the work that you do at CASEL?
Sure. So CASEL is the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, and we work to advance evidence-based social emotional learning in schools and districts and states across the country. We do that really through advancing research, policy, and practice, and my work sits in that practice realm. So I get the pleasure of working with mainly large urban school districts across the country who are trying to embed social emotional learning into everything they do and to really use SEL as a lever for equity, as a lever for excellence for all, and really build social emotional learning in a systemic way in their schools and districts.
So that phrase, social emotional learning, I know it was something that was out there with what I call as BP before the pandemic. It was something that was really gaining traction, but because of the pandemic, it really has accelerated to the conversations that I'm having with school districts. That's the first thing that is spoken about before you talk about learning loss or assessment or any of that. How has the crisis changed the way CASEL approaches your work? More specifically, can you talk about some of the threats to student trauma in the new remote setup in terms of isolation and increased screen time, exposure to inappropriate content? I'll let you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we are absolutely seeing the same thing about that accelerated attention to SEL, which we are pleased about for sure. And I think, we have always known that there is no learning without the context of a relationship and without attention to the social emotional wellness and growth of our students. And, I think we are really supporting districts and schools to think about, how do we double down on those efforts and how do we take those best practices of building social emotional competence into building equitable learning environments to do that, whether that's remote or hybrid or in person, to be very intentional about taking that time to check in and make sure every student has a individual connection, to make sure that we are building in shared agreements around, how do we want to be as a community, whether that's online or in person, what are our agreements with one another, and then how do we build the skills to be able to do that, and then to restore when those agreements may be broken for any reason. So yeah. I think you're absolutely right that attending to sort of a holistic view of students' wellness, yes, we want to pay attention to any academic struggles, and to get to those academic struggles, we have to make sure that our students have their basic needs met and their social, emotional, and mental health needs met as well.
Yeah. Can you go a little deeper into the process? I mean, how specifically do you work with districts to integrate these concepts into a day-to-day life cycle in the school?
Right. Yeah. So really that work begins with just sort of setting a vision, understanding, what is the work many districts and schools are already doing work around SEL. They just may not be thinking of it as such and being intentional about that. So what's our shared vision for, when our students leave this school or leave this district, what do we truly want them to know and be able to do? And yes, there's an academic component to that, but there is certainly a social emotional component to that. So having that shared vision, understanding of where we've been, setting goals, and then really building sort of a relationship and building that coalition of folks who are going to align their work around social emotional learning. And then we talk a lot about the adults. So I think early in the days of social emotional learning, it was very much focused on programming for students or curricula for students, but we've learned a lot about adult social emotional learning, and particularly in this moment, taking time to allow staff members at a school to connect, to heal, to reflect on the past few months, to say, I've learned a lot about myself as an educator, or here's where I've struggled as an educator or as a human being, and how do we bring that into the school space? I think we can't pretend that that's not existing for all of the adults in our building. And then we want to model that care and space and reflection that they can then bring to their students, which is really the third part that we see in districts and schools. So how are you being intentional about creating a learning environment that honors SEL? How are you taking time in the schedule to intentionally and explicitly build social emotional skills? And then how are you integrating that into your academic content and your other teaching? So you can reflect on social emotional skills in a math lesson, in a science lesson, and do that really intentionally and create sort of a coherent experience for students. And then connecting deeply with families, community members, students themselves in a way that really helps us understand data and use data as a way to share power and share understanding and continuously improve our work.
Well, that's interesting. You talk about the data. now that we're in this situation, and obviously we have these remote learning and hybrid setups where technology is an integral part of that. Can you go a little deeper into how you collect the data and how you respond to the data?
Yeah, we're seeing some pretty innovative practices across the country. I think we have districts that are doing one-on-one touch points with every family or every student to get a sense of, of course, are their technology needs met? Are their food and housing needs met? But then going deeper into, what was it like for you these past few months? What did you maybe like about distance learning, remote learning? What was a struggle for you? Reflecting on yourself as a learner so that we can tailor our supports and our teaching to each student. We have schools and districts doing surveys of families, surveys of students. We have some using apps that allow them to reflect on sort of the wellness of each student and to practice mindfulness, or lots of innovative ways of using technology in this moment, I think. And even just making sure that, in a distance learning model, we are focused on, here's our opportunity to, even if we're not in a room together, we can still create connection. We can still allow students to talk in pairs or talk in teams and then come back together. So taking what we know about best practices in teaching and learning and building those into a remote environment.
Can you talk a little bit about the process when a district is going through that survey and going through those touch points where maybe a trauma is identified, where you see a student or a family that is in well, we're all in crisis, right? But a particular crisis that is a little above and beyond. How does that work into district procedure, right? I mean, when you're in person, something happens in the school, there's a certain set of protocols that you follow. How does that work in remote land here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we talked earlier that one of that first steps in this process is really building those relationships and coalition. And that includes, your internal school-based mental health professionals. So that may be your school psychologist, your counselor, your social workers. These are critical players that I think are doing incredible work now to connect with students and families and to manage crisis like that. And then we also see schools connecting with community-based organizations that may be able to fill some of those gaps that they may not be able to fulfill with their own staff, and provide counseling, to provide crisis intervention. So I think it's, we've got to think about these relationships and that broader ecosystem around our schools to support students and families in ways that may stretch beyond even what we were doing before the pandemic.
Right. Tell us a little bit about the work that CASEL's done over the summer. I know that you've developed a roadmap for districts who maybe haven't begun this journey or even approached the idea of social emotional learning. Maybe for our listeners, give them some ideas about how to get started.
Sure. Yeah. So we were excited. We worked at CASEL with over 40 partners across the country to develop this roadmap. And I think follows a similar journey to what I described around building that infrastructure for SEL through understanding, what do you already have in place, reflecting on SEL programming and your distance learning programming, and then building a team to really guide this work and thinking about what does it mean to do this for the adults? So I think we are seeing some districts have, restorative circles for principals where they're able to reflect on their own learning and their own needs and the incredible stresses that they are under in this moment. We see principals then bringing their staff together to have those same types of reflections and meetings, and teaming teachers in new ways to support one another. Things that may not have been possible when we were in our classrooms may be possible now, to think differently about who's with young people at different times. And then being very intentional about taking those first days, those first weeks to build community, to open up some space for reflection and to practice our social emotional skills. And I think we are very clear, we have action steps within each of these critical practices that I'm laying out, and then sustainability steps, because we really don't see this as something just for these next few weeks or few months, that really SEL is critical no matter what space we're in and what time we're in. And so we want to build some habits that then sustain over the course of this year and many years to come.
Well, that was the perfect segue into my last question, which was, is this something that you expect to be now baked into the way that schools operate? I mean, is this a positive that we can take away from the pandemic, that these sort of techniques will become standard?
It's a great question. Certainly that's my hope. I think we're having a lot of educators realizing how much they need this for themselves and as individuals, how critical their social emotional competence and cultural competence has been for them in this moment. So I think then bringing that to the classrooms, and the more we build it into schedules, build it into our vision for our school, build it into our curriculum, the more these become sustainable practices. And I think you see the fruits of that labor, and then you want to do more of it. And we know that for the wellness of our adults and the wellness and learning and success of our students, that this is critical.
Well, Karen, thanks again for your time. I think there was a lot of great insight that came out of that, and I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Kevin. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks again to Karen for joining us today. And now here's a little snippet of some of the work that CASEL does, taking those concepts of social emotional learning and applying them into the day-to-day business of a school. Take a look.
I'm a data guy, I like numbers, and we have a lot of evidence that social emotional learning has made a difference.
We had a graduation rate of 62%. Last year we put up a record-breaking 84%.
Over the last 5 years, our expulsions have been cut in half.
We were suspending about 13,000 days of out-of-school suspension. We were 10 times the average for any school district in Ohio. And within that first year alone, we were able to reduce our out-of-school suspensions by 55%.
Attendance rates went up. We know that attendance is directly correlated to academic improvement and achievement, but it also had other outcomes that were extremely important, which is students feeling more connected to schools, educators having to think outside the box, helping students overcome some of the challenges that are in their life.
There's an 11-to-1 return on investment. So for every dollar invested in programming around social emotional learning, we're seeing that they're saving $11 on remedial programs, dropout prevention. There's lots of reasons that people are coming to the conclusion that this is something that we need to be prioritizing.
Okay, great. We are now here at the live portion of the event. Very excited. First time experiment for all of us, so just really looking forward to having a great conversation. And with me today, Mike Hurt and Eileen Bellistock, both longtime advisors for me in my coverage of education technology, both very innovative educators in their own right in their districts, but also two of the best accents in the field of ed tech. One from the great state of Texas and the other from the great state of Massachusetts. Welcome, guys, to our first premier live leadership event.
Thank you, Kevin. And I'm glad you read the little introduction that I wrote for you. Thank you about how innovative we both are. So yes. Thank you.
Well, I guess we want to just get started. If you can each give us a little bit of a background around your district, the size of it, how long you've been there, and then maybe talk a little bit about what I like to call BP and DP. So, and when we're talking about social emotional learning and the need to protect students while they're online, not only when they're online in class, but also at home, and what the difference is between before a pandemic and now. Mike, maybe we could get started with you.
Okay. So this is my 6th year in Wichita Falls, and excited to be here, excited to get to share with you. Wichita Falls is in North Texas, way up by the Oklahoma border, about 2.5 hours or so from Dallas. And so I consider us an urban rural district. So we have about 14,000 students, 67% or so free and reduced lunch. Pretty diverse district as far as that goes. And I think, and I like that BP and AP. Before the pandemic last spring, we were doing well, and things were just rocking right along, and we were just getting ready to go to spring break. And then March 13th was the last day for us. And we did not go back to school last year after that. And the main thing we were worried about when we spent about 4 days on our transition. We think we've been preparing technology-wise for about 6 years for online instruction, but we were not ready for all the taking care of our families, providing some sort of sense of normalcy for our students. And so we took about 4 days to work on instructional stuff, but immediately we started with food deliveries. We started with getting devices out to people that did not have devices if we had them to share. Our biggest issue was Wi-Fi. We had about 2,000 of our 14,000 families did not have Wi-Fi access. And so that was tough. And so we really spent a lot of time that first several weeks of at the end of March, 1st of April, getting families taken care of. I mean, we had donations that came in from foundations and stuff. So we did a pretty awesome job with that. But we also learned a lot. And we knew that coming back this fall was going to be tough for us. We started back face-to-face on August 20th, and we had about 63% of our students come back face-to-face, 37% stayed online. So they had the option as far as that goes. And then they had the option to make a change at 6 weeks and 9 weeks. And so now I think we're going to end up at about 72% face-to-face and 27% online for us.
Great. And Eileen, tell us a little bit about your setup.
So I am the Director of Technology and Information for the Nauset Public Schools in Massachusetts. If anybody knows Cape Cod, that's where I have the pleasure of working every day. We have about 2,500 students, 7 schools, 5 school committees or boards. Interesting thing is I've been in the district for about 8 weeks. So I came at the end of July, which everybody's telling me is the worst possible time to start a job as a tech director in a new district. Prior to that, I was out in the Northern Berkshires, another vacation spot, up until the end of July. So we had about 1,200 students there. We were already one-to-one with devices from K to 12. We already had Khajiit hotspots in place. We already had Gaggle as our student safety management program. So we had been doing a lot of the work prior to COVID happened. And like Mike's district, as soon as COVID happened, we made sure that families who may needed additional Wi-Fi support or more devices got them. We also made sure for the safety of our families and feeding them and everything else. Our biggest challenge for us was training teachers. Our teachers had been working towards developing competencies in online learning, but it wasn't a requirement. It wasn't part of their curriculum. So it was a big push to how do we support our families, how do we support our students, and especially how do we support our staff to all of a sudden go from the brick and mortar type of learning to a completely online learning. We also had to make some decisions about the best platform to use, the best products to use. So now I'm in this new district. They had some great programs in place that they were not at the place where I had been in my last district. So it was a scramble to try and get new programming in, get the Khajiit hotspots, get Gaggle, get all those things back here that I had in my last district. But I'm pleased to say that all our elementary schools are face-to-face 5 days a week. Our middle school is hybrid only because of the amount of space we have in the building. So, cohorts come in 2 days and remote the other 2 or 3 days. Our high school was remote for a short period of time because of some HVAC issues. Now they're coming back in again, hybrid. So I'm pleased to say that our elementary schools, the kids are coming to school every day, and that's a huge accomplishment in this time of COVID, because that's not happening in a lot of school districts.
Absolutely. So Karen and I spoke about the importance of building a culture that emphasizes social emotional learning and how important that was before COVID, and now it's even more important than ever. Mike, maybe you could talk about the more day-to-day reality of implementing big picture ideas into a day-to-day. And I know that the intro video from York, they talked a little bit about that, but like, how do you, and specifically through the use of technology, how do you accomplish creating that culture? And which sounds like you still have a remote and somewhat of a hybrid setup as well.
We do. In the spring when we started, our goal was weekly interaction with every single student in the district, once a week, touch base. Yes, we had assignments going on, and we had students that were remote without access, and they had paper packets that were delivered to them. And so it was a phone call. Everybody else who had access, it was, let's have a conversation, check in with their family once a week for instruction purposes. And then every Friday, check in with their family for how are you doing? Social, emotional, what's going on in your world? Can we help you with anything? And I mean, we did that kind of through advisories. This fall, we have most of our, or all of our secondary campuses are synchronous. The students that are remote are synchronous. So they meet every day with their 7-period or 8-period day with all their teachers and all their class. And it's projected up on the screen with the rest of the students are the remote students. And so they meet every day on a regular basis. Our elementary schools, the goal is at least one interaction from a teacher every day. And that is primarily for instruction, but also for the idea of checking in on students. How are you doing? We have Gaggle that we use to monitor stuff. We have all of our devices that we've given out to students. We're a Google reference district, our Chromebooks. And so we have iBoss and we have GoGuardian. And so we're able to monitor all that, what they're doing online, but having that individual conversation with a student, how are you doing? How's your world? And let's talk about instruction stuff too. It has been our teachers' big focus. And that's just it's been awesome to see.
That's great. Eileen, any thoughts about what strategies you've been implementing this fall that might be different as a result of the pandemic?
Well, interesting. Massachusetts is a union state, so especially in the spring, we struggled with the amount of time on learning that was happening because of MOUs and contractual issues. So we really focused on the social emotional well-being of our students. I had been researching some social emotional programs, and so I was able to implement them pretty quickly with some fabulous vendors to get those up and running. So at least, our students at risk were able, or even our special ed students were able to make connections with them and assess them and provide them the support they needed. I have to say that our school psychologists, guidance counselors, and adjustment counselors were amazing. So I don't feel like the students got as much learning as education as they did, but they got the support they needed, which I think in the spring was critical. So now as we're moving into the fall, we're keeping those same things in place, like what Mike's doing is checking in, emailing families. And Mike and I were talking earlier about the fact that Zoom meetings or Google Meet meetings has actually provided us with opportunities to see what home life looks like for many of our students. We're able to see, as when they come into school, we could see if they were hungry, if they hadn't showered, or they'd been beaten up at home or whatever. But now we're seeing what their family life is about. And I'm hearing from my teachers about the interventions that they're doing, because they're getting to see what's going on in the background. They're seeing how comfortable students are at home. Do they feel safe? Are they in a safe environment? And it's provided us with a really strong way for us to connect with students in ways that I didn't think that would happen when we first went remote back in the spring. So I think we're actually connecting with families and students a lot better because we have alternatives And the only way we can teach our students is to connect with them.
Yeah.
Why aren't you showing up for class? What's going on? Why is your camera always off? A lot of things like that are really important.
Can I add something to that real quick, Kevin?
Sure.
I think that's important. We have on our website, we have basically a helpline that says, do you need counseling services, or would you like a counselor to contact you? And we found ourselves throughout last spring, and it's carried over here into the fall, having families requesting counseling. In other words, mom wants to talk to the counselor about her child's behavior. And we, our counselors are Johnny on the spot, and they're definitely ready to help out, but we're doing a lot more referrals now to some of our outside agencies for that. And that's because I think parents, they used to be like kind of at an arm's length as far as the parent involvement part. Now they're WFISD adjunct professors because they're at home with their child, teaching, helping their child facilitate this learning, and they're getting a lot more interaction with teachers. And I think they feel more comfortable asking for help. And so we find ourselves in that situation more often than we definitely did before.
And Mike, we kind of snuck it into some of our surveys on Wi-Fi, our surveys about whether you're taking the bus, and asking those questions. Do you want someone to reach out to you? Are you struggling? Do you need help? So because we're sending out these surveys for other reasons, we're able to get more data about what's going on and how we can support our families. I think it's awesome.
Yeah, there's definitely an odd intimacy that happens. I mean, as a parent, I've had parent-teacher conferences and had more communication with my kids' teachers than probably ever before. To your point about the arm's length, that was always me. Talk a little bit more about the data, Eileen. So you're collecting the surveys, but you're really kind of getting down to the individual student. Is this an example of maybe the idea of personalized learning accelerating to where you're identifying individual students, right?
Oh, absolutely. And we have the situation with the hotspots. How do we find out what families need hotspots? Well, you can't really, like if I sent out a survey saying, who wants a hotspot? Free data for a year. I'm going to get a lot of yeses. So by asking these kind of, doing these surveys of saying, what kind of connectivity do you have at home? What kind of service are you using? Is your child able to do his homework? We're finding that we can connect with those families a lot better and actually reach out to them and say, hey, we can help you. We can provide the hotspots. We can provide a way for your student to connect with their teacher. Because what's happening is, a student doesn't turn in his homework. Well, maybe the family's too proud to say, I don't have Wi-Fi. So by doing these kind of surveys, we're getting down to figuring out, okay, is it due to connectivity? Is it due to a situation at home that's not safe? Is it due to the child not engaged? A lot of things are going on, and these surveys may seem simple on the surface level, but they really give us a lot of data that allows us to then reach out to the families and say, hey, we're here to help.
Yeah, Mike, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we probably collect too much data on stuff like that, and we use our counselors have gotten really good at getting discipline data, and we involve them in more discipline issues, especially our secondary level. We have SEL counselors that's focused strictly on that. They're not guidance counselors. They're working with individual students, and they set up their groups based on discipline referrals that we have on campus, and also through our use with Gaggle, we've determined lots of common themes. Students that are struggling with divorce, students that are struggling with fear or depression or hunger, and because you get that from what they're posting online and what their chats are with their friends and what they're writing about. And so we collect that data, and our counselors have set up small groups using that kind of information. And then we're also able to, and unfortunately had to share with our local authorities several times whenever we have students that obviously seem scared and obviously are having issues at home whenever we do get online with them. and have made reports to local law enforcement, and that's unfortunate, but that's kind of the reality we live in.
And I think when we talk about data, I think it's I hear it all the time, and I think it's important that we recognize it, that we have so much data in our student information systems. We have so much data in our nurses' systems. And so much data from Gaggle, and we really need to find a way to connect all that data to really look at the whole child, look at their discipline records, attendance records, grades, things like that. How many times did they go to the nurse? What their grades look like. But I think Gaggle and a lot of the SIS systems are really working towards creating an interoperable system that allows us to see the whole child. And that's what Karen talked about, is really supporting the whole child. And without that data being aggregated just into a point where we can say, okay, this is a profile of what this child is happening right now. So.
All right, well, that allows me to put my libertarian hat on and sit in the school board meeting and talk about student privacy and about that data and about the collection of it. I mean, when you have a service like Gaggle, Mike, I mean, you can see what students are writing in Google Docs as well as what they're sending in an email, right? I mean, how from a district standpoint, what are the protocols there?
So for me, it's much like when I was a high school principal and I went into their locker, searched their locker, or I searched their car. Anything on school property or that is school property is subject to being looked at by any administrator. So I think and we talked about this earlier, was having an acceptable use policy, responsible use policies, and being very upfront and clear with parents, saying the expectation is if we feel there's an unsafe situation, whether it's your child's backpack, their car, their device, their Google Drive, we have every right to look in it, because we're looking into it to keep your child safe. And interestingly, and Gaggle will talk about this, is I always wondered why students would put a suicide note in their school Google Drive. And they're doing it because they want to be heard. They want to be found. They're reaching out for help. And so I think it's an important tool, and I get it, but Mike can speak to it too, but it's we're doing it for safety. It is not like we're trying to invade someone's privacy.
We don't apologize for it. If you're using a WFISD device, you need to know, and then I think it gives so many parents reassurance that we're taking care of their children. Mm-hmm. In other words, especially the ones that are real strict with student online use at home, they know that whenever they get on our devices, they're locked down, and then what they're putting into that device, we're able to filter it and figure out if it's going to be of harm. And whenever you save one child's life who's considering a self-harm situation, that's enough. But unfortunately, I think we're probably close to a dozen now over the last 3 years that we've intervened to avoid potential self-harm. And it's one of those things we can't turn off. So we don't apologize for it, and we really have not had an issue with parents saying you're overstepping. We tell students up front and parents that we're going to overstep, and we're going to be all in that.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess if the transparency is there, then all bets are off. I'm happy to say we're starting to get some questions come in from the audience. If you guys are ready, one came in talking about it in this new remote setup that there's so much more increased screen time for the students for the remote, and then possibly exposure to inappropriate content and predators. Is this something that is of concern to you? And if so, how are you dealing with it?
I'll start. Our only Google Meet bombers are our own students who will share their entry code with one of their friends from another campus or somewhere else, and they'll get into a meet that they shouldn't be in. And we get them out pretty quick, but our system's pretty locked down as far as that goes. We don't have much of that, But the online time, when we have secondary students that are expected to be online, or at least available online for about 7 hours a day, we make sure that they have time, that they have breaks, and teachers give them breaks. They've gotten real good about that. When we get on, when class starts, I expect you to log on. I'll take attendance. We'll have a mini lesson, and then you'll have time to be off camera for a while, and then you'll be back on camera at this time. And so they've really gotten adapted to this new way of doing things. But you're right. There is a lot of screen time involved, but for people that have chosen to stay at home and be remote, that's kind of their new reality.
So from my perspective, I don't believe, in being the tech director, I'm saying this, but I don't believe that students should be online a lot. I think this is an opportunity for us to get into project-based learning, teaching those kids the skills to be able to, connect with the key teacher to be in a class, and then they're going to go work on a research paper, or go interview someone of interest, or collaborate with their fellow students in the class. I think less screen time is important, and what it lends itself to is teachers getting really creative about asynchronous projects. I feel like, and this happened in the beginning, was the teacher was trying to replicate what was happening in their class in an online environment, and it did not work. No. And it will not work now. So my thought is, if the teacher is on the screen more than 10 minutes, shut it off. Now is the time for students to go off. Students also need time to reflect and start, thinking and creating. And if they're sitting in front of a screen, I know we are, it's like you can't do anything else. So I agree they need to connect with their teacher, but I'm also a big proponent of asynchronous learning. I think that's the only way we're going to get our students ready for when they leave us. So, and as for the other part, we do a lot of education with our teachers about safeguards of what to do with Google Meet and Zoom. We've had a couple of situations and we've worked through it, but it's all about education, teaching our teachers and students how best to work online. Filters are extremely important. In fact, some of our E-rate money is tied to it. I'm finding that some districts don't have, once the devices go home, they don't go through our network. So there's no filtering of devices when they go home. That's a real concern. So they can go to those inappropriate sites. They can do things they shouldn't be doing because they're not being filtered through our system.
Right. And so, but that's just something that we have to deal with, I guess, right? I mean, that falls upon the...
We have to solve it. We have to solve it. There's no reason that we can't keep our children as safe and at home as we do in school.
Yeah. Another question coming in about the hybrid setup. And I know my boys are actually in the hybrid setup too, where it seems like it's a bit better when the teacher's in the classroom with half the students, and then half the students are remote, in terms of engagement and in terms of kind of a dynamic within the classroom. It's not perfect, obviously, but it's a lot better than the teacher being at their kitchen table, being as frazzled as a parent as they are as a teacher. Have you seen any other kind of improvements happen as we go through this phase of this new reality of the use of technology?
So I wouldn't say it's a perfect system, because our teachers are struggling with having students remote in on a smart board. So can we show their faces? Can we record anything? Can we, and everybody having headphones, even the ones in the classroom. So it's almost like everybody's remote at the same time, because if you're interacting with people at home, you got to wear your headphones, or it's going to be a lot of feedback in the classroom.
Yeah.
I'm also having teachers struggle with, they're going from a class and face-to-face them, and then the next class is totally remote. So the content that they're teaching with the kids in front of them, they can't do with the kids remote because they're spending so much time troubleshooting. So they're extremely frustrated that they can't get through as much of a lesson with their remote kids as they can with their in-person, yet they want to make sure they both have the same experience.
Right.
So the coolest thing by far is our teachers have figured out how to do group assignments, and all of our students have their own Chromebook, and so they come to school with that. And so what our teachers are doing is they're pairing an online student with a face-to-face student and giving them assignments to do, and they're working together through that at the same time. So they'll go off into their own little room, their Google Meet room, and hang out with their class, with their classmates, and while the teacher's working with some other students or whatever it is, and that helps that student who's at home feel connected to the class and a part of the class whenever they can continue to work with their peers. And it's been so awesome to watch I think the resiliency of students throughout this process.
Totally great. Totally agree with that. A comment that just came into your answer though, Mike. With a hybrid setup, how can a teacher be teaching in person and be expected to answer questions from remote learners? Even though that's what I'm doing right now. Go ahead.
So at our secondary level, it's all synchronous, and so the 6 students who are remote are on the board and they're live, their mics are off, and so when we're having class discussion, they're talking the same time that the students that are in class are talking, and so it is a normal give and take. But then again, we have, I guess, a robust enough network so that way they can do that and be real time, and so all their peers can see them, and because they're all doing a Google Meet at the same time, they're able to see their friend face to face whenever they start talking, because it pans to them individually. At the elementary level, our teachers have gotten really good whenever with their small groups, and that they'll have a group of students that are just the remote students. And so as they're going to their 4 or 5 different stations, when it gets around to the teacher table, now I have a group of 5 students who are online, and I'm working with those 5 students. Or if you grouped them differently, these 3 students come to my table now, and I have 2 that are remote with this group, and they're working together. And so that's really cool when it's synchronous and they're able to do that. The asynchronous opportunities, which is primarily at our elementary schools, that's harder to connect with those students, especially when they're not able to get online during the day. And our younger students, the hardest are Ks and 1s, is connecting with them in meaningful ways during the day. You get a lot of work that's turned in asynchronously before midnight, and whether parents are doing it or not, it's a different story. But connecting with our youngest students, K1, 2, even pre-K, with those parents, and they have them in their lap, or we're working with them. Those are hard. That's been a harder process than our older students, I think.
Is that something that again is a change as a result of the current situation, especially with the younger students? And Mike, you mentioned before that the parents are now adjunct professors.
They are.
But then you also have this wider community of parents as well as faculty. Just the entire community, all of our communities are kind of in this state of group trauma, right? Have you found your responsibilities now going beyond the student and looking at the whole? We talk about the whole child, right, Eileen? And now we're talking about the whole community.
Yeah,
and I know Karen in her interview talked about the fact restorative practice, and we do a lot of that with our students. But now we need to look at, like Karen suggested, our administrators have restorative reflection times. Our staff have restorative reflection times. I find that our kids, like you're all saying, are very resilient. They're thrilled to be connecting with their peers. They are excited no matter how they're connecting, but our teachers and our administrators are spent, and they're trying to do the best they can. And we need to remember that we need to have not only the whole child, but the whole teacher, the whole administrator. So
we've had a couple instances where we've had classrooms that have been quarantined. Especially at the pre-K and K level, because they're not required to wear masks. Our state order is 10 years old and above, and our district order is first grade and above. are required to wear masks. So our pre-Ks and Ks don't. And so we've had a couple pre-Ks and a couple K classrooms that the whole class has been quarantined because a student or staff member tested positive, and therefore they're all considered close contacts. Well, they go home, and the next day they're online, and the teacher's online from their house, and the students are online from their house, and they just have class, and everyone's online. And so that's been so cool to see. And when you have a bunch of pre-K students, we're a Capturing Kids Hearts district, which is a pretty cool program. And we always like to start with "Tell me something good." And they sometimes those "Tell me something good" sessions last 20 and 30 minutes, even an hour. Oh, look, here's my new puppy. Look what I drew for my mom. And they spend a lot of time doing that. And when you have pre-K kids that are connecting, and they're so excited to get on, just like Eileen said, with their fellow classmates. That's awesome, and that's what makes a lot of this worth it. That I know they're not at school. We want them at school. We'd rather have them face to face and be able to give them a hug, but we're not even hugging the ones that are face to face right now. So.
Right. So we're starting to run out of time, and I really appreciate both of you guys giving your time, as well as the participants. A lot of good questions coming in. I'd like to wrap it up by kind of trying to keep the glass half full here. And maybe see if you see any of these techniques, strategies for keeping students safe mentally and physically in the classroom and at home. Are there things out of this that are going to stick around? I mean, is the Zoom communication, will that continue? And maybe go back to Karen a little bit. This new sensation of, I don't know, there's a great amount of empathy that I've noticed from everybody in the education space, making sure that everyone is feeling safe and secure. I hope you say yes, but do you see a lot of this stuff kind of sticking around even when we go to after pandemic?
So I'll speak to that first. I hate to say yay COVID, but tech directors, we're getting what we've had a vision for a long time. We wanted these innovations to happen, and only unfortunately due to a pandemic they did. But now we're teaching students in a whole new way, and I don't see us ever going back. We're putting money and funding right where they need it to our child's education, whether it's providing connectivity or devices or curriculum or supports like SEL programs and things like that. We were years away from a lot of these programs coming into play, and our kids couldn't afford to wait that long. So I think I am a very half full person, and I feel like we're gonna be better and better out of this. We are, and technology, I'm happy to say, is going to be a big part of that. So,
yeah, I agree completely. I sure hope not. I sure hope we don't go back to the way it was.
Yeah.
and luckily, we've had a lot of those requirements, seat time requirements lifted because of this. But we have lots of students that benefit from this type of system. We've looked at. We're about to put in our own private LTE network where we have wireless throughout our community for our devices to extend our network. And that would not have happened as quick as it did. We thought about it, but it wouldn't happen as quick as it did. And then as far as our wraparound services for students throughout our district, we've connected all of those dots. And that's kind of our United Way thing, is connect our dots in our community. And our community has just stood up and really figured out, okay, this family's refrigerator just went out. Okay, by tomorrow we have them a new refrigerator. And because they can't afford one on their own. And we wouldn't have known that stuff because they're now putting it in their feedback to our teachers and our staff. Yeah, well, our refrigerator went out yesterday, and okay, we'll help you with that. And so, So anyway, all the SEL stuff, the wraparound services that we're able to do, and if ACEs was not a term that people knew about before, they do now. And so our students have so many more stressors in their life that are magnified, I think, because of this. And so If we didn't see that before, we see it now, and I really do hope that this does not ever go back to the way it was.
Well, both those answers give me hope.
Yes.
I think that, this has been a terrific conversation. So much to absorb from it. I knew the toughest part of this entire event would be to stop the conversation, but we're up against it. Once again, thank you guys for joining us today. Thanks to Gaggle for sponsoring the event and getting us together on our first Premier Live event for eSchool News. And most especially want to thank the audience for not only listening but participating. And we'll try to get any questions that went unanswered, get you some answers to those. And with that, I'll sign off. This is Kevin Hogan. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.